I'm Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. Joe Biden is now the 46th president of the United States of America. His predecessor, Donald Trump, has flown off to his resort in Florida, awaiting to see whether or not he will soon be indicted and possibly stand trial, or whether he'll escape those charges and try to run again for president in 2024. The Biden administration has already set out a sweeping set of executive actions and proposed legislation, from immigration to climate change to healthcare, and of course, steps to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. But that's the easy part. The hard part is to establish where America is going next. Only 2 weeks ago, before Joe Biden became the 46th president, a group of people instigated by Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building, trying to stop Congress from confirming President Biden. 5 people died in that attack. The Capitol was trashed. It was looted. Human feces smeared on the walls. The first time that US citizens had attacked the symbolic center of the nation. So which do we have going forward? Do we have an America which sees a recovery, a new way forward after so much polarization in the last 4 years? Or was the Capitol attack just a sign of further division? In other words, is America broken? Well, I've got the ideal person to talk about this. For more than 30 years, I've known Professor Liam Kennedy. He's now the director of the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. But before that, he and I were colleagues at the University of Birmingham. Liam was among the folks in the United Kingdom who really developed the field of American studies. Culture, politics, literature, photography, they all intersect. He's written about all of those. And he's written about that combination where we can try to understand America, even as we're outside it, from within. Here's what he wrote this week. The storming of the Capitol building produced startling scenes of anarchy, the symbolism heightened by the intense media coverage of the event. This was a frighteningly apt visual representation and conclusion of the Trump presidency, a 4-year-long trashing of democracy, always in plain sight, yet rarely so dramatically performed. So Liam Kennedy, welcome to World Unfiltered. And tell me, is America broken?
Thanks, Scott. It's always good to talk to you and to be reminded that I've been doing so for 31 years, which is quite something. A real pleasure. Is America broken? We're seeing a lot of conversations around that, not just this week, but I think there's been quite a few conversations developing around that over the last 4 years. And I've got mixed views on it. On the one hand, really it depends what you mean by broken. And I think when people make that statement, they're conflating certain issues. On the one hand, if you are understanding the United States as a state, is it broken? I think it's on the way to being broken, but not entirely. In other words, I think the institutions were deeply damaged over the last 4 years. I'm thinking particularly the institutions of liberal democracy have been, damaged in all kinds of ways. Liberal democracy has been damaged as a political ideology, which was quite normative in the United States for half a century. The question of rights and responsibilities of citizens, the protection of the rule of law, these things have really come, I think, under huge pressure. But are they broken? I'm not absolutely sure they are. After all, the election produced what seems to be a relatively fair result in conditions which were very, very difficult, difficult for those who were seeking to oversee and to regulate under the pressure of a president who was saying that this was a fake election, that this was a false election. So I think if you look at that, you would say, oh, come on, America's not entirely broken if it could successfully get through that period and produce Joe Biden as president. But I actually think when people ask this question about America being broken, they're not only talking about America as a state, they're talking about America as a nation. And that's interesting because there what you're talking about is America as an idea. And that, I think, is broken. And that is deeply damaging, not just for people within the United States who have lost a lot of confidence in comedy, in community, even in understanding a shared history. But I think that that's very important around the world because the idea of America is something that has been hugely influential in America positioning itself within the liberal world order for 50 years. And that idea might be irretrievably broken.
So what's that idea? What is America in quotes?
I think it's got various components, but in one way to think about it is through the idea of American exceptionalism. That is really essentially the idea that the United States was founded, if one takes it as a founding by European settlers, that it was founded as what was called an asylum nation. In other words, it was a nation where a new kind of state could be built. It was a nation which would not repeat the mistakes of an aristocratic Europe. And it was a nation that would give birth to the democratic experiment of democracy in a fresh way, influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment. All of this is very idealistic, but also very powerful in American culture, not just in political culture, but in public culture. I suppose the per relative of those grand ideas is what we call the American dream. And as I'm suggesting, that is something that, although one can belittle it, I think has had a lot of purchase, both domestically and through the culture, but I think it's had a lot of international purchase as well. That's not to say everyone buys up to the idea of America, but many countries around the world, many populations around the world, many young folks around the world have grown up, I think, over the last 3 or 4 generations, looking at America in an optimistic and positive fashion. I grew up in that way in Ireland, in Northern Ireland myself. I don't think that the younger generations are looking at America in the same way again. So it's that idea of America, America as asylum nation, America as beacon to the world, America as upholder of rights and responsibilities beyond its shores. That America is possibly broken.
Okay, we'll talk about America as we see it on the outside for a moment, but put yourself back in America, and almost in a sense, your entire career, you've been doing that, to put yourself inside America, even from, watching it from afar. You could, America, you could say, was under tension in the 1930s during the Depression. You could say that coming out of World War II, you then get into the civil rights movement, which for all the advances of that movement was a great time of turmoil at the same time as the Vietnam War.
Right.
70s, Watergate. We could talk about the division of Reagan in the 80s. I guess I'm saying is that, it sort of was the idea of America already broken in the past. And if you're saying, well, no, that idea was there, that idea persisted, what makes now so different?
It's a good question, and the reason I think there is a greater rupture now than the previous examples that you give is because I think that the internal rupture is so deep, and that then is being reproduced externally, reproduced through foreign policy, America first, but also just reproduced through the mediation of that the people around the world are watching America fall apart in real time. I mean, that has been the case for 4 years, and it has become spectacularly interesting just to watch America collapse over the last year in particular. The reason why I think it's so dangerous and damaging at this point in time is that I don't see any obvious regenerative force emerging. And I'd really like to hear what you think of that, because I maybe we're a little different here. I know Biden is presenting himself as that regenerative force. I'm hopeful that he will succeed. I'm just currently skeptical.
Well, let's take it on with what Joe Biden has said and what you've actually addressed and what you've written recently. And Biden said of the Capitol attack, this is not who we are. And you struck back forcefully and have said, no, wait, those people, not just the guys who paraded about, and we can talk about performance if you wish, but those who were there not just to perform, but to attack. You're saying this is who we are, or at least who some Americans are. What do you mean by that?
I do believe that. I wrote that in the aftermath of the event. I wrote it through some emotion, perhaps, anger at what had happened there, confusion. But I would stand over that statement. Joe Biden said what he needed to say as president-elect. He stood up and he said, listen, these are extremists in the Capitol. They're a small minority of people. They are not us. They are not America. I think he's wrong. I think that they are a lot of America, maybe as much as 40-odd% of America, possibly even a little bit higher. That's not to say that everyone who's attacking the Capitol building is a Republican or a conservative. But I think within the moment of that attack, what you saw was a reproduction of a lot of the anger, disaffection, confusion, and just pure delusion of almost half of America, who've been living in increasingly an alternative reality where social media meets conspiracy theory. And there is a media ecology that feeds that, a huge bubble. And that bubble is not made up of the few people who attacked the Capitol building. That bubble is massive. And the communicative systems that they were sharing in order to actually construct that attack, I think, are indicative of that. So the alt-right, which is a rather disparate kind of, grouping of organizations and so on, I think it constitutes a growing counterculture, which is what I was arguing in that piece. They are a counterculture in that they come together with certain ideas and values that do cohere. They mightn't be yours or mine. They're not liberal. And at its extremes are fascist, are Nazi, but nonetheless, at their core, have a huge appeal to many of these disaffected, mostly white Americans who want to take America back again. And you're back to that claiming of an America that they don't think is theirs. I do not think that is the story of a few extremists.
Okay, well, let me work with you on this, because on the one hand, you're saying like 48% of Americans might support or have some affinity for those who attack the Capitol. And then you say those who attack the Capitol are fascist. Now, logically,
at the extremes.
At the extremes. Well, what is it though that makes that connection where you've got the extremes and those 48% who aren't fascist, who aren't Nazis, as you just provocatively said, still will in effect not detach themselves from that, at least completely detach themselves from it. What is it that holds it all together? Is it conspiracy theory, or is there some type of justified anger that holds this together?
I think it's a great question. I think it's both, and it can be both. In other words, on the one hand, it's conspiracy theory, which has really found its media and métier, I think, through social media, right? Where this conspiracy theory can flow and it can connect people in ways that wasn't possible with mainstream media gatekeepers and so on and so forth. So I think that there is an opening up to that kind of language and thinking and reinforcement of that identity through communication that we're seeing again and again. If you're outside of that, it looks obsessive, it looks dangerous, it probably is all of those things, but I'm not sure we understand it fully or well enough. I think that it is quite possible for well-meaning, decent Americans to look at this, think that it's unacceptable behavior, and still vote for Trump. There is no contradiction for those people. They can do that. And
if Trump were to disappear?
It would be a great magic trick if you know how to do that. I don't think it's going to happen because, of course, well, when you say disappear, I know you mean that as a relative term. I think it's very important that Twitter, for the time being at least, has taken away a lot of his oxygen. But Trump is not going to disappear, and we both know that. The question is, what will the new appearance look like, and how impactful will it be, and who is going to listen, and who is going to be motivated or activated by all of that? And clearly the Republican Party are watching that very carefully as well, it seems to me.
Okay, well, all right, let me test you on the ground where you've made a lot of your academic career, but also as a public intellectual, and you've talked about American culture, which plays back, sometimes divisions, sometimes ruptures, sometimes negotiations, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you've studied American writers. I can think about Don DeLillo. I can think about Scott Erickson, who have talked about, for example, the white noise in American culture, have talked about an American culture which quite often in its, quote, reality, if that makes sense, fragments, and people try to piece it back together again. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you're a big country music fan, and you've talked about country music as being a force which has held Americans together, quite often through deprivation, quite often through hardship, but has also had that image of America abroad, for example, in Northern Ireland, where you grew up, where there was some type of negotiation. I mean, is there a cultural regenerative force that you could find right now to juxtapose with this damage of social media?
I'm not sure where it is, and I'd be intrigued if people who are watching or listening to this conversation would come up with examples. It's a question I've seen posed over the last 4 years, people trying to answer it. But the reason it's so difficult to answer goes back to one of our starting points there, and that is the collapse of a consensus, certainly the collapse of a liberal consensus, but I think a collapse of a cultural consensus in the United States. Now, there are some who would argue that cultural consensus was never fully in place, that the tensions, the divisions that we're seeing have been there for a very long time and now exploding. But of course, the fragmentation that we see is such that I don't see a cultural narrative that can suture or bring together those different elements of America. I mean, fundamentally, we have two tribes, we have two Americas, right? I think within that, you've got many other divisions, but I don't see clear cultural bridges over that. Certainly not country music, which itself has, an appeal to and a narrativization to essentially white folks, which is ironic given its roots in Black culture, but that is the case. I think, on the other hand, you have many forms of music in the United States that are based in other racial and ethnic components, which are not necessarily listened to in the same volume or by the same folks who are tying themselves into country music. So I don't think it's that clear cut with culture, but I think that there are patterns there. But one of the things I'm not seeing are clear bridges within those divisions.
Well, let me try it out with you then, to link culture up with politics, and I'm not necessarily going to go completely with like Little Nas, right, to talk to you about doing country music and what that's done in terms of bridging rap and country. Let's talk about a politics where I look back at 2009, and what I'm looking at is sort of the highlight of the illusion of past American consensus, which was largely a white consensus, but the possibility of a new consensus, which was there in that inauguration 12 years ago, where we did have 1.5 million people on the Washington Mall. We had hope and change, and we had the first Black president.
Yep.
And even if we don't have the people there because of the pandemic, this week, we've got America's first Black vice president. She's first woman vice president. She's the first Asian American vice president.
Yep.
We've got a very diverse or a diversified Congress. We've got diversified state and local legislators. We've got activists on the ground. Could it be possibly that what you're seeing as being the damaged America, and I agree with you, Trump has damaged America, is merely a transition to a new type of negotiation in which we had to go through this. We had to go through the fact that it wasn't going to be a white consensus in a very different America.
I think there's a lot to what you say, and when I'm in a positive frame of mind, that's the reading I convince myself with. I'm just not completely convinced on it today or at other points in time. If you take the reading that you're projecting, and I think it's a strong one, then you probably see something like the Capitol riots as a kind of last gasp of white supremacy because demographics are against them. I'm not quite sure, though, that I do buy into that. I think something's also been unleashed and is actually growing, not dying. It's not a last gasp. It's possibly the first skirmish in some kind of civil war. Now, I'm not talking about civil war where people are, militarily going into full-blown battle. I'm talking about something that's already happening. There is a cultural civil war in the United States. I think it's absolutely present. We talk about the culture wars, not new. It's been going since at least the 1960s. It waxes and wanes, but it's very full-blown. There's absolutely no question about that. On top of that, if you go back to that moment of hope with Obama's presidency, I shared in it, but I also have to say that it proved to be a false dawn. What we know is that during the Obama presidency, racialized politics, the role of white identity in US politics became more salient electorally during his terms. We saw greater losses of Democratic House seats in non-urban areas than we'd seen at any other point over the last 50 years. We saw America pulling apart, in other words, under the Obama administration, and a lot of that had to do with racial division. Yes, 2008, the economic crash, then obviously becomes part of that as well. It's not just race. I think the word status is an interesting way to think about this. It's a combination of racial identification and economic status coming together. And I think that the disaffection and the anger that many people feel are usually a combination of these things. And so they feel triply disenfranchised. They feel that they're no part of the political elites, that Washington is the enemy. They feel that culturally America is not theirs because Hollywood runs it or the New York Times runs it, and they don't see themselves in those representations. And they think, of course, that economically they're not being given a chance, and that the people who've just come into the country, barely legally or illegally, are getting free stuff from the government. So those are the kinds of worldviews you're getting, and those are not the worldviews of a few extremists in the Capitol. Those are the worldviews of millions of Americans.
So is there anything that the new administration, the Biden administration, can do, whether it be in tone or in policy, that would provide for some possibility of regeneration, or if not that, at least get an advantage in what you're calling the cultural civil war, an advantage that would be necessary in the longer term to bring a more positive America?
I think that, and I think Biden and his team will make efforts to be regenerative. They will make efforts to be conciliatory. I think that they will do that, though, in a fairly hard-headed way. In other words, that they will be prepared to move forward as best they can and as fast they can if they're getting no feedback, if they're getting no help on the Republican wings. Some of the hearings, I think, are already suggesting that in various ways. I think if we go forward, though, what will be absolutely crucial is the tone of Biden, which I think has been helpful. I think that Biden is in a certain kind of way the right person for the political job. In other words, his persona, I think, fits the mood of America, not of all of America, but a more aggressive politician in that role at this point in time would certainly not, I think, be helping America or the Democratic Party. So there may be progressives within the Democratic Party who will not be entirely happy with Joe Biden's approach. But I think that Biden is a smart politician. I think he's got very smart people around him. And I think that he will try and create both a big camp to keep those progressives involved. And at the same time, I think he will engage Republicans. But the bottom line, I really think, is that he has to find ways to stimulate economic growth for people who have not seen it in 20 or 30 years. That's the core. And that will include, and that will peel away, I think, quite a number of those conservatives at the moment who are still in doubt about where they want to go.
So at the end of the day, a bit of Karl Marx is still useful here in terms
Yeah.
of what happens. But let's look outside the U.S., where again, you very usefully have provided sort of a roadmap for the way that this plays out in various parts of the world. But still, to test you out before we get to the present day and take it. I mean, I hear from a lot of folks when I talk about that ideal of America, and they'll come back, and this isn't just the anti-imperialist left. But they'll say, like, come on, America in Asia, look at Vietnam, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Look at America in the Middle East, even before the destructive wars in Iraq. And you talk about Israel-Palestine, you talk about other issues there. You look about America in Latin America, the US and Latin America, it wasn't American, that idea of city on a hill always an illusion for most of the world's population?
I completely agree with you. I mean, we have to be careful here. One of the things that I'm not suggesting is that we need to return to the American foreign policy of 4 years ago or earlier. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, Trump's foreign policy deliberately set out to trash that approach, right? It said, look, the idea of a liberal world order led by the United States is not working to our advantage, right? We must have America first. I think he's wrong about what he put in place of that projection of a liberal world order, but I don't think that liberal projection was working either. And so Biden has an opportunity with the foreign policy team that he selects now to recalibrate that approach. And I think that probably has no choice either, because I think, in fact, the world has moved on in the last 4 years. And that I think that we are not going to see, I think, America rushing into multilateral agreements too quickly. I think there's going to be care taken in that, and as we go forward. But to come back to what you were saying about let's be honest, the hypocrisy of American foreign policy for the last 70 or 80 years. In other words, leading the world, the sense that it's leading a free world, the idea that it's promoting, liberal democracy. We can see contradictions in that again and again and again. We can call out hypocrisy in different parts of the world, in South America and the Middle East. But I think within that, there were activities, actions, and even rhetoric that did, in fact, embolden people in parts of the world to push back at autocratic leadership. And I think that there were models there for people around the world to think about. There is a world leader who can potentially stand up for us, who will work with multilateral organizations, and smaller states might find a voice and get listened to in a way that is impossible in talking to an American first leadership. So it's relative. I'm not lionizing the American foreign policy that preceded Trump, but I think it certainly was much more engaged in the world in terms of a sense of relationships and engagements with the world that were not as principally about America getting what it wanted first and foremost. America always got what it wanted, but I think in a different way, and in a way where others could gain as well.
Okay, well, let's cut to the chase in 2021, because you put a great deal of skepticism on American regeneration. You're the director of a center named after an American president in a country where a lot of the media is celebrating an election of another president they're claiming is theirs because of his Irish ancestry.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, can you make the argument that the path to regeneration, at least for America, is there, for example, in Ireland, that image of America still has a certain power for all the hypocrisy, all the tensions that we talk about, where that offers you a small positive step forward? Let's take it from your home patch first.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that Irish perspective. There's there's a deep history to that, obviously, right? So just very quickly, the numbers, the millions of Irish people who've left this relatively small island to go to the United States over 200 odd years are quite incredible, and especially in the 19th century. At the last American national census in 2010, there will be another one soon. 33.5 million Americans claimed Irish descent. I mean, that's an astonishing number. It's over 10% of the population. And so there's only 6 million people, 6 and a bit million people on the island of Ireland in total. So there's a very strong relation historically there, for fairly obvious reasons, between this small island and this very powerful country across the Atlantic, as you can understand. So Ireland takes a very strong interest in American politics, American culture, and much else. And I suppose takes a certain pride in those presidents of Irish descent. Not in all of them, I have to add quickly. And by the way, Scott, as I'm sure you're well aware, 30 American presidents are of Irish descent. That's a very large number. It's a very, very large proportion. But it's really, I think, since the visit of President Kennedy in 1963, that has been a very important relationship diplomatically. And so what Ireland has sought to do, as small nation states do, is it's sort of try to use that to its advantage in lobbying in Washington, around the Northern Irish conflict, now around Brexit and so on. So there's always a lot of interest there. And so with the election of Joe Biden, someone who is very directly of Irish descent and proud and claims that Irishness, I think that Irish people are happy to see his arrival. They're happy to engage with that. But I don't think they're doing that naively based just on his Irishness. I think they're also very happy that he's not Donald Trump.
And that leads me, I guess, to my final question for you, which is, I take on all the writing, everything you talk about the challenges that lie ahead. But at the very least, isn't not Trump an opening for America internationally? Don't you actually benefit from how far you've dropped to be able to start to build back up?
You clearly do. There's already been a bump, if you like, around the world. There's polls are regularly taken about how do people view the United States. I mean, not surprisingly, most powerful nation state. Most countries are interested in how their citizens look at it. But there's also forms of polling within the United States that are trying to look at public opinion of other countries. So we've quite a lot of data on those perspectives. Now they're a little bit woolly, feelings and perspectives, but they're quite interesting. And if you look at that data over the last 4 years, I've looked at a little bit of it. What you see, and perhaps this is not surprising, is that what you might call the world image or the public image of America in the world has sunk to the lowest levels of all polling over the last 4 years. And most of that is attached to the perspective of the world on Donald Trump. That's not true of every country. There are certain countries that Trump is quite popular in. But for most of the world, that has been the case. So already with Trump being removed from the presidency, and can I use that past tense? We're almost there. Being removed from the presidency, you see a bump. Those polls have already risen. And I don't think it's because of Joe Biden. I think it's because, as you put it, it's not Trump. But that means that, of course, we still have to find out what follows not Trump. And where those polls go will be interesting. One of the things that one does see in some of that polling is that while people are very positive about Trump leaving, there's still quite a bit of apprehension about where America's going. And there are reasons for that. First, the last 4 years have been shocking, even traumatic for many people, not only in the US, but externally. B, it creates a distrust of the United States. That's very hard to rebuild around simply through one election. But C, and this is really true of the diplomatic communities internationally, there is a sense that he or his acolytes could return 4 years from now. So how engaged do we now want to get for the US? So there's this little bit of disquiet there still, despite the ebullience and the immediate sense of elation.
Okay, well, I think maybe we'll reach the point where we can say America, in quotes, is bent, if not necessarily broken.
Cracked.
We had, yeah, it's cracked, but we have to see if the cracks will be repaired down the road. Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining World Unfiltered today. Yep. Folks, thank you all for joining us for that discussion. Chip in as you through your own comments on the World Unfiltered site via Deep Dive Politics. Deep Dive Politics, you can find it on Facebook under that name or under Twitter at @dive_politics. Once again, we're going to keep on fighting the good fight here. Hope you all as well. Stay safe, stay sane. See you next time on World Unfiltered. Bye.